Welcome to Let's Talk Micro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I hope you had a great week. And you can always find Let's Talk Micro on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, TuneIn Radio, GoodPods. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find Let's Talk Micro. As far as social media, I am on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube as Let's Talk Micro, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, on LinkedIn as Luis Plaza, and I have an email address which is letstalkmicro@outlook.com. So please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please go ahead and leave a review. Any feedback, any suggestions, either via social media, via email, they are always welcome and appreciated. So thank you for the support and continue downloading episodes. And if you haven't checked out the previous episode, please go ahead and do so. It was just some older content that I went ahead and did a little bit of editing, and then I went ahead and re-released it with some comments and things like that. But it was an episode that was originally episode 57, which then it's now 119, and it is about Streptococcus pneumoniae. And this episode, like others, they are great content that was released early in the podcast when maybe I didn't have as many followers and not as much reception as I have now. So I thought it would be good to give those episodes like a fair chance. As more people start following the podcast, they become aware of it, to release that content so they can go ahead and revisit it. And I hope it benefits, medical laboratory scientists and microbiologists. So in this episode, I talk about Streptococcus pneumoniae, I talk about the gram stain, I go over morphology, uptakin, and the bile solubility test. So if you haven't checked that out, please go ahead and do so. And before I talk about today's episode, I just want to say real quick, I don't know if you're following me on social media, you saw that I had the opportunity to have an article feature in the website of Dr. Timothy Gauthier, who's a pharmacist. And I think that Dr. Gauthier, has a very similar goal as I do, which is, to share information. So he's very active in the community, very active in social media. So I had the chance to have an article feature on the website idstewardship.com where I talk about the podcast, about why I started it, about things microbiology, about medical laboratory sciences, about all the information. So overall, it was a great article. So thank you, Dr. Gauthier, for the opportunity. It's always great seeing people out there that are trying to use their knowledge and their education to make this profession better. And as I mentioned before, antibiotics, it's a lot of information. It can be very daunting, a little bit intimidating. So if you are looking to learn more about antibiotics, please check out the learnantibiotics.com website and the Learn Antibiotics book, which is available on Amazon. And this is from Dr. Gauthier. So, this book and the resources, they include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more. And these resources are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you. So definitely check it out. I had the opportunity to check the book and the website as well. And it has a lot of great information. So I invite you to please go ahead and check it out. So I'm just going to make this short and quick. So today's episode is about fluoroquinolones. And those of you that have been waiting on the next episode of the AMR subseries, as you know, we started with an overview, and then we went on to talk about beta-lactams with Dr. Brian Rowe. And this one has a guest as well. And of course, co-hosting with me the series is Dr. Andrea Prinzi. So in this episode, our guest, Dr. Minkey Wungwattana, he comes to the podcast to talk about fluoroquinolones. And he starts giving a historical overview. He goes over the mechanism of action. He gives all sorts of interesting information like generations of fluoroquinolones. He talks about Salmonella and breakpoints for fluoroquinolones. He talks about CLSI. And he wraps up with a nice message an interesting message about saving fluoroquinolones for a rainy day. So in the spirit of Let's Talk Micro, this was broken down as simple as we can. And I hope you enjoy it. So let's go ahead and listen to it. So I know I've seen some comments in social media and I've seen some feedback, and I had this question asked. When is the AMR subseries coming back? So if you've been waiting for that, this is the episode for you. And I also, I urge you to, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes of the AMR subseries, and I'll be talking about it a little bit, go ahead and check them out. we did an introduction and we did an episode about beta-lactams. So if this is the first episode that you're tuning in, maybe you have listened to the podcast before. We started doing a sub-series within the podcast about antimicrobial resistance. And in the spirit of Let's Talk Micro, we like breaking things down, making it simple. And I know that those of you that work in the lab, you get all this information that sometimes you feel overwhelmed, so many resources. So what we're trying to do in this segment here is to go ahead and break down the antimicrobials and point to the resources where you can find this information. So in this series today, I have a guest, but of course, I have my co-host, which is Dr. Andrea Princey. How are you, Andrea?
Good morning. I'm doing great. I'm running a little crazy with the holidays, but it's a happy time overall. How are you?
Pretty good. The same, just I finished school, so just something good. So now I just have work, and then I get to, I'm doing a little bit of traveling over the holidays, so I get to take a little break. So this is the good time of the year when I actually get a break. I'm still going over my master's, so I take classes over the summer and a lot going on. So it's a nice time to slow down a little bit and relax.
Good for you. I have missed doing our little sub-series here, so I'm happy we're squeezing one in before the end of the year.
Definitely, same here. So like I said when I opened, we have a guest. So you want to go ahead and introduce our guest, Andrea?
Yes, yes, I'm very excited too. So, as you know, I love to invite any friends or colleagues that I'm lucky enough to work with to the show, especially my infectious disease PharmD colleagues, because they're some of my favorite people. I think Pharm such a great relationship with them as clinical laboratorians. And so we have another one today. Today we have Dr. Minkey Wungwattana. Minkey attended Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana for his Doctor of Pharmacy degree. And after graduation, he completed his postgraduate training in general pharmacy practice and infectious diseases at Indiana University Health in Indianapolis, Indiana. And he works with me now at BMRU. We're lucky enough to have gotten him over this past summer. But prior to that, Minkey spent the last 10 years practicing antimicrobial stewardship at Maine Medical Center, 8 years in the acute care setting, and 2 years in the outpatient setting. At Maine Health, the health system Maine Medical Center is a part of, Minkey had the opportunity to work with the amazing microbiology team at NordDX. Little shout out to the micro team over there. This was a unique experience in that NordDX provided microbiology services to not only Maine Health, but additional non-Maine Health clients as well. So he comes to us with a wealth of experience working with both the microbiology lab and in clinical practice overall. So we're super delighted to have him today, and he's going to be walking us through all things fluoroquinolones. So welcome, Minkey. Delighted to have you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Luis, for the invitation to come talk on your podcast series too. So, antibiotic resistance and micro, laboratory connections is part of my passion and part of why I joined BMU. So, I'm excited to be here talking to you guys about fluoroquinolones.
Well, definitely a pleasure having you on, and it's definitely great having someone that to the goal of the podcast, which is share information and make things a little bit easier. As I mentioned in the opening, this is a lot of information, and sometimes we're thrown there in the lab, and then okay, yeah, you're training for 4 weeks, and then you're seeing all this, and you're like so overwhelmed. So having a little something that you can go back and at the very least point the resources and make it easier, it's a huge goal of mine, and I appreciate people that join me along that journey.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Anything else before we actually start the episode about the recap of the series, Andrew? Anything that you want to add?
I would just add that just a reminder to the audience, we do always disclose a conflict of interest. We do work in the in vitro diagnostics industry, but this podcast is not representative of that in any way. This is just a discussion about medical concepts. And because we are clinical microbiologists and infectious disease clinicians, we love to continue to do education around these concepts. It's really important to our daily work. And so that's why we do this, but we are not promoting anything in any way. And I just like to always disclose that at the beginning. And that's it.
Definitely. So, as I mentioned before, the previous episode was about beta-lactams. So today's episode is about fluoroquinolones. So, Binky, can you go ahead and maybe take us a little bit of going back to the discovery of them, and maybe start touching on the chemical structure of them?
Yeah, definitely. And a quick shout out to the previous episode, 2 episodes too, that you and Andrea had recorded. So I won't spill any spoilers if you haven't listened to the beta lactam episode yet. But Dr. Brian Rao did a wonderful job of giving us a nice history lesson of how beta lactams were discovered, and especially the discovery by Dr. Alexander Fleming. Now with the fluoroquinolone class, which is another from in the clinical world, the clinical field, highly utilized, but also highly contested, highly discussed, highly controversial, whatever term you want to throw out there, for many reasons. And we'll talk about a little bit of that today. Fluoroquinolones, and interestingly different than the beta lactam class, was not discovered through kind of natural means or natural production from other bacteria. It was actually discovered in 1962. Interesting story, though, always an interesting story with antibiotic discovery, was that it was discovered during the synthesis of chloroquine. So it was a byproduct. So there's a drug called nalidixic acid, which some parts of the world may or may not still use today. It's not quite used as often in the United States, mainly because we have some more potent or more readily available and sometimes even cheaper fluoroquinolones like ciprofloxacin and levofloxacin. But nalidixic acid was the very first fluoroquinolone ever discovered by accident, kind of, as people were trying to synthesize chloroquine. Really, the mechanism of action of fluoroquinolones is super unique, very different than the beta-lactam class. If we think about a bacterial cell, you've got all sorts of areas, right, that we can try to target or conceptually target to try to kill the bacteria or stop the multiplication and growth of it. And fluoroquinolones specifically work very deep inside the cell. So kind of, if you close your eyes for a second and imagine the bacterial cell, you have the cell wall, you have the cytoplasmic space, and then deep within the bacterial cell, you've got the DNA area piece of the organism. So in a kind of 10,000 foot view, where fluoroquinolones work is deep in the cell at the DNA level. And there's 2 main enzymes that fluoroquinolones act on. One is the DNA gyrase, or topoisomerase 2, and then topoisomerase 4. There are a couple other topoisomerases within the bacterial cell, 1 and 3. Fortunately, these are not targets of fluoroquinolones. And just throughout the history of development of fluoroquinolones, what you will see if you pick up some historical articles and read the timeline, very similar to beta lactams. You have generations. You have first generation, second generation, third. And what scientists have done is they've tinkered with carbon groups and fluoride groups. And through tinkering, what you get are just changes in activity. You get changes in absorption, but also you get changes in side effects. So without going too deep in detail, these are kind of some of the nuts and bolts and quirks of fluoroquinolones.
I just want to jump in here really quickly because I'm so glad you just brought up nalidixic acid. Luis, are you all still using nalidixic acid in your susceptibility testing to sort of screen for fluoroquinolone resistance and salmonella, or no? Is that an outdated practice in your setting?
No, we are not.
So old school micro, that's, and some centers may still be doing this. We used to do that really routinely. When I started in the micro lab I was in, it was, 2008 or 2009. It was fairly common practice to use it as a surrogate for fluoroquinolone resistance, and that's not really widely accepted anymore. Minkey, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but I think there's other resistance mechanisms now that we know about, and so some of these bugs may test susceptible to nalidixic acid, but be resistant to something like ciprofloxacin, so it's not really as useful anymore. But we used to use that all the time, so I'm glad you brought that up in the history.
Yeah, it's got a historical kind of place. We definitely can't forget the first one ever. When we placed nalidixic acid in the generation timeline, it's certainly the first generation. And so the first generation fluoroquinolones as a group, they're wonderful gram-negative drugs, very, very good activity. But the 2 kind of big holes where they don't really do well is the gram-positive, the aerobic gram-positive, and the anaerobic side of things. And so as we see infections caused by gram-positives and anaerobic bacteria grow around that time, you get scientists trying to manipulate, trying to play around with nalidixic acid and other first-generation fluoroquinolones to try to increase the activity. So if we jump forward a little bit to the second generations, you have examples that you might see in the microlab or in the clinical practice world. You have drugs like norfloxacin, ciprofloxacin, and levofloxacin. So what you get there is you get a increase or growth in gram-positive activity when you compare it to the first generations. But there's still, you got that hole still. So while you get increased gram-positive, you might get a little bit more staph and strep. Where you still have the big hole is the anaerobic activity.
It's really interesting.
I just wanted to add that as Andrea asked me that question, it took me back in time a little bit. And I hadn't thought about that. And I remember when I was starting to train in bacteriology that I remember doing that we had a disc and we put it and then we checked based on that. Yeah. So it just brought that memory. I just wanted to share that with the audience. Maybe some of you that might be newer medical lab scientists might not be familiar with this, or some of you that might be a little more experienced, have more time in the lab, remember this. So I just wanted to, share that experience. And I know that, so you talked about, you touched on the activity, and as far as for the fluoroquinolones, like depending on the infection, does that correlate with which type of fluoroquinolone you use, or do you use some for certain infections and some for others?
Yeah, so it would be great, right, if all fluoroquinolones were created equal. We can just substitute one for the other, or as we move regionally or globally, you might have certain areas where this fluoroquinolone is cheaper, so let's use that one, or this fluoroquinolone has less side effects, so let's use that one, and kind of substitute in and out based on activity. They do have somewhat identical or similar activity, but where I'll give a little bit of nuance is, so you have a little bit of slight spread in differences in gram positive versus gram negative, but then you also have slight differences in the resistance mechanism profiles. So let's start with the activity, and then we'll dive very surface level into minor differences in the resistance mechanism. So ciprofloxacin and levofloxacin, those are two great head-to-head examples to try to compare and contrast. So levofloxacin, the way that drug works is it mainly works on the DNA gyrase. And so this molecule was manipulated so much that it increased the ability to enter gram-positive cells. So its distribution into gram-positive cells is a little bit better than ciprofloxacin, whereas ciprofloxacin is a DNA gyrase or topoisomerase 2 and a topoisomerase 4. It kind of works in both of those areas. And it's, to me, the way I try to categorize Cipro versus Levo is that ciprofloxacin is more of a gram-negative drug and levofloxacin is more of a gram-positive drug. Now, that being said, a lot of clinicians like to use levofloxacin in clinical cases where you've got both. So let's think of areas where you might have both gram-positive and gram-negative. So you might have abscesses or urinary tract infections. So levofloxacin plays a huge role and does really well there, because if you're blind, if your cultures aren't growing, but you go, I've got a gram-positive and potentially gram-negative problem, let's go with one that does both. Okay. But for me, when I get a gram-negative specific infection, I tend to lean on the ciprofloxacin more than levo. In terms of the resistance mechanisms, you do have some minor nuances. So for testing, I know, Luis, your question was, can we just test one and then refer kind of drug two to the first one? Well, that becomes a little bit tricky. So what I do advise, and I think it'd be good for clinicians too, is to test one of each. So there's usually a gram-negative representative, quote unquote, and then there's a gram-positive representative fluoroquinolone. And for me here in the United States, ciprofloxacin would be your gram-negative representative, and between levo and moxifloxacin, that's another one I would test for the gram-positive representative, just so that you can see both sides of the coin in case you have resistance either way.
Okay. Yeah, and then just for the audience, that was something that I definitely wanted to talk about, because that's something that those of you that are listening out there, we get hit with the requests, and sometimes you might be in a lab where just you working the bench, and then you're like, okay, I got this request. So it's always good to know either can you infer one drug from the other. Things like intrinsic resistance also, that do I need to be performing that test? Where do I look? Which on previous episodes, we touched on the CLSI and the appendix about intrinsic resistance. as I was reading, I mean, I couldn't see any. I don't know if anything comes off the top of your head, but is there any intrinsic resistance when it comes to fluoroquinolones, any organisms?
Well, I wouldn't say any group of organisms with intrinsic resistance other than methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. So for the longest time, there has been a struggle to finding a fluoroquinolone that can treat that subsection of bacteria. So none of the first, second, third, fourth generation, Cipro, Levo, Moxie, none of them have potent enough activity against MRSA, but came along a drug called delafloxacin. So that was manipulated enough that it does have MRSA activity now. So you've got some FDA approvals there to allow that drug to be used in clinical scenarios that MRSA might be involved with. So that's kind of the newest kid on the block.
Well, thank you for that. That was actually, yeah. I mean, we have Delaflux in our lab as well. So thank you for that information. It's always great to know what's behind all these drugs, and I know one thing that Andrea, when it comes to, let's talk about, I know you might have some questions about breakpoints, right? So that's always important to discuss. So do you have any questions about breakpoints?
Do I ever? We can't have a controversial episode about a controversial antibiotic class without talking about a controversial topic known as breakpoints. So I guess I'm just thinking about, what's useful to medical laboratorians and when we're thinking about doing susceptibility testing, what's helpful for us to think about and talk about. And Minkey, I think it would be really interesting for the audience if we could walk through some of the breakpoint changes that have happened recently with respect to fluoroquinolones and then Enterobacterales, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and then diving a little deeper into the Enterobacterales with Salmonella. Could you give us a little clinical background on the Enterobacterales and why those breakpoint changes happened in 2019? Any clinical context there? And then I'll probably hit on some laboratory pearls that I think folks should just be aware of.
Yeah, definitely. So we take a step back real quick and get out of the fluoroquinolone mindset and just think of what interpretive breakpoints are. So interpretive breakpoints are supposed to be, the way I view it, translational tools to go from a result that you guys help produce in the microbiology lab and translate it to a kind of quick and easy, dirty, without having to spend minutes to hours interpreting a result for a clinician to say, can I use a drug to treat this patient A safely, but also successfully? And we've come up with ranges of categories, called susceptible, intermediate, and resistant, to really send a signal, a very quick signal to the end clinician bedside user and say, oh, this is resistant. There is no dose, no frequency, no amount of drug that you can give safely, right? Safely is my key word, because in the world of microbiology, I always view it as, oh, you can give a little bit above any MIC and kill the organism. But at the same rate, when we apply clinical mindset, are you going to kill your host, or are you going to cause so much toxicity that it doesn't matter if you kill the bacteria, the host is going to suffer? So the R category stands for, you would need doses so high that your host would die or they would suffer. Intermediate is that range where, it's a little bit higher. You might have higher rates of reported failures, but it could be potentially doable by manipulating doses and frequencies. And then the S, the nice bright green S, is, clinicians love to see that because it's, whatever the package insert and typical dosing schemes that are given to patients, we know they're safe. We know they're well tolerated. And then giving that green S, it gives the clinician that warm comfort feeling that we can treat it successfully. So going back to your question, Andrea, the changes were made to the Enterobacterales because there were ranges of MICs that we were starting to see clinical failures. And that's generally what leads to a lot of breakpoint changes or reevaluation of previously set breakpoints. Is maybe you discover certain new resistance patterns that you didn't know before, or maybe because of rampant usage of a certain drug worldwide or locally, you may have the majority of organisms now be living at a higher MIC than previously before. So with Enterobacterales and Pseudomonas, you see a kind of a push down a little bit with lower MICs being called susceptible, and then the resistant upper end of resistant range to be lowered as well. And mainly because at the doses that were given of both Cipro and Levo, we were seeing a lot of clinical failures in both Enterobacterales and Pseudomonas. And so to create that nice, easy translational tool for clinicians, we want to give them the right answer, which is now any MICs above the new breakpoints, they're now, you want to be questioning whether you want to use that drug or not.
This is awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate you giving that broad background. For anyone that's listening that hasn't hit that breakpoints episode that Luis did earlier in the Let's Talk Micro podcast, I recommend checking that one out, especially if this it's confusing for everyone. Breakpoints are a challenging concept with a lot of moving parts to them. So I suggest checking that out, but that was a really great introduction to why these things change. And I think an important thing for folks to always remember is this is why the clinician and medical laboratory collaboration is so important, because as Minkey was referencing, there's this huge clinical impact to breakpoint changes and a lot of clinical data that feeds into why a breakpoint might change. So, treatment failures, like he mentioned, or, they notice that the dosing is needs modification based on toxicities, things like that. And then we're also taking into account these MIC distributions of the organism and what we know about that. But then ultimately, the laboratory has to decide how to implement these changes and what's feasible based on resources or staffing, or what the clinical team wants, or what's available on formulary at that given institution. And so there's a lot to consider other than just, hey, the breakpoints changed and now they have to be used. And there's some interesting things to consider with the fluoroquinolone changes for these organism groups. So specifically, Enterobacterales, not including Salmonella, we'll get to that in a second. It was an interesting change because when these were lowered, the new breakpoints, so I think that the old, correct me if I'm wrong, I think was for Cipro was greater than, was anything, I think it was 1, and then Levo was 2, and now everything has moved down to, for Cipro, susceptible is less than or equal to 0.25, intermediate is 0.5, resistant is greater than or equal to 1. And for Levo, and Levo is 0.5, 1, and 2. So they've come down quite a bit. And so the challenge for labs there is sometimes you have to stop and say, okay, so how many of the isolates we see were actually impacted by these breakpoint changes? How is that going to impact the volume of testing or the modifications that we do? And in this case, most of the isolates out there fall below 1 or 2. So most of the ones that are getting tested in medical laboratories are falling within these ranges. And so the testing has to be figured out. And the reason I say that is because if you look at, for example, the Pseudomonas changes, there's a great publication, I think it was by Romney, Humphrey, and teams explaining, and the group of authors, they're explaining the breakpoint changes and how to implement these from several years ago. And I think it said that about 10% of isolates, Pseudomonas aeruginosa isolates, were impacted by this lowering. So not nearly as many as that broader Enterobacterales group, where you have to think about pretty much every Enterobacterales organism that comes through that's getting tested against a fluoroquinolone. And so in thinking about this, I think the laboratory really has to consider what's been cleared on my automated system, if that's what I'm using, because doing manual testing for every one of those Enterobacterales is probably not going to be feasible, just in terms of staffing and resources and time. And so that's where it's really important to get in touch with the manufacturer and see what's been cleared, see if any customer letters have come out. Sometimes after an original clearance, the manufacturer will do an internal validation, demonstrate that the breakpoints perform in an acceptable way for this bug drug combo, and then we'll issue, a notification for customers on how to get things updated in their system. Sometimes there's a full-on, software update, new panel or card or something that can help accommodate this. And so when you have so many bugs that you have to test that are impacted by breakpoint changes, that's probably the most reasonable way to go. There are really great recommendations available in some of the publications that have come out through ASM, specifically the manuscript by Romney Humphreys and team that's discussing all these breakpoint updates that happened since 2010. We can link that or make that available for the audience later. Where they give you some algorithms to think through in terms of plans for getting things updated. So in the case of the Enterobacteriales group for Cipro and Levo, you'd have to validate these if they were not cleared on your system. And that would mean, quite a bit of work for the laboratory, but it's an important thing to do and probably worth the effort, definitely worth the effort because so much of the testing is going to be done and probably requires automation. Considering when fluoroquinolones really need to be released, what's actually being used at your institution. These things are also really important. Teaming up with the clinical team and figuring out, are they asking for Cipro and Levo and, any other fluoroquinolone on all these, or are they only requesting one most of the time? Is there something that you could only test on request? There's a lot of different ways to adjust the update to breakpoints and the testing that's done based on what the clinical team needs. So those are just really important things to consider and talk to your clinical team about.
Yeah, Andrea, I have looking at the CSI breakpoint chart right now and some of the changes. So did it ever make you guys go crazy that these breakpoints are not ever the same number? Like Cipro went from less than or equal to 1 susceptible to less than or equal to 0.5, but then Levo has 2 down to 0.5, right? So it goes back to the point that Luis was making earlier of, can we infer? Can we say, let's test one and apply the other? So I was just curious, did that ever drive you guys nuts that these numbers never matched?
I don't know that it drove me nuts, but I think when you don't have the full picture of how these things are really determined, you're kind of like, why is that? And what's going into this? Why would one be different than another? I don't know about Luis. Does that bug you?
Maybe a little bit. Yeah, not that much. I mean, I think for me, it's always right to make sure that I like to be in places where they're updated and they keep up with it. I have been in places where they haven't, and something came to mind when you were talking about Minkey about the ciprofloxacin, and I remember a facility where that they were still using that breakpoint with the 1, and I don't know, it just came to mind. But overall, not much. I think for me, just always to make sure that that they are updated and bring the information out there and make sure that people know and they're aware and things like that.
For sure. And I will say, kind of prospectively from the clinical ID side, it drives us a little nuts sometimes when we have other clinicians, non-ID folks, who call us. And let's say, for example, susceptibility profile only showed 1 for a quinolone. And so you've got, let's say they had Levo and they either hid Cipro or they just had issues with performing Levo, or sorry, Cipro, and you have a result that says levofloxacin 0.5 susceptible. And so you go, okay, the clinician calls you up and they go, oh, does this mean I can use ciprofloxacin? And then you kind of got to, pause and have them take a break a little bit, because 0.5 is actually intermediate for ciprofloxacin under the Enterobacteriaceae category. So it's, taking the time out, pausing, and teaching that clinician too about how there's a little bit of nuance and that you can't infer one for the other as safely as you'd want. So that's kind of why, going back to my point earlier, I think it's good to have your lab do both Cipro and Levo. And that way, if one was resistant or intermediate, you still might have the other one as an option. So that opens up a lot of doors for patients.
For sure. This is a really important conversation that I'm glad Luis brought up earlier, because like he said, the lab does get called a lot with these kinds of questions, especially if one drug is suppressed and the other is released, or if the other one just isn't tested for. This happens a lot. And I would say to folks in the lab, just remember, I mean, Luis said this before, but I'll just say it again, the CLSI M100 has amazing commentary, sometimes before or after the tables, with the specific ranges for breakpoints, or also in the appendices in the back that talk about things like intrinsic resistance. There's tables for intrinsic resistance. There's discussion around when you might be able to infer susceptibility from one drug to another. Often they'll have a specific comment that says that in the M100. So it's such a good resource. Don't forget to look things up there. They're wonderful and really informative. So just make sure to refer to that and don't guess. And then, Minkey, I want to ask you about, while we're on the topic of breakpoint changes, one thing, speaking of things that were confusing or frustrating in the lab, at least for me, was I felt like when I was working the bench, the Salmonella specific breakpoints were always confusing to me. So I think folks in the lab know that, I mean, I think most procedures are written to say, okay, so anything from the stool, Salmonella from the stool, really doesn't need routine susceptibility testing except in special populations. Like I come from pediatrics, so it was warranted probably more often than not, or, maybe some immunosuppressed populations, it may be appropriate. But generally speaking, we're not doing routine susceptibility testing on those isolates. In cases of extra-intestinal Salmonella isolates, or specifically like enteric fevers, the Salmonella typhi, paratyphi, that's always being done, right? But I think if you're in the lab, you know that most of the time you are setting up a disc or a gradient diffusion e-test strip, for example, on these extra-intestinal Salmonella isolates, and there are different breakpoints for Salmonella. Can you help us understand why that is?
Yeah. So this is partly why I love ID. There's a ton of good history out there, and everything in ID has a historical reference. And so Salmonella, as an organism, has that, and why it broke off and had started to have its own category for breakpoints, and also why it was lowered back in 2013. So with anything that gets broken out that used to be part of a group, the first thing I go to is, are there certain exceptions? Did we discover something? Was there something that is unique about this secondary subspecies? In this case, it's Salmonella, as that's different than the other Enterobacteriaceae. And the answer is yes, and that's mainly due to the clinical outcomes in patients that did have extraintestinal Salmonella, compared to using old breakpoints versus new breakpoints. So what I mean by that is, okay, if we give the same drug dose and frequency that we do for your run-of-the-mill Enterobacteriaceae like E. coli, and then let's say we apply the same breakpoints to Salmonella and the outcomes are the same, then you could say, okay, let's categorize them similarly. Let's apply the same breakpoints because clinical outcomes are fairly similar. With the case with Salmonella and extraintestinal Salmonella, that wasn't the case. So when we apply breakpoints that are a little bit higher for Enterobacteriaceae to Salmonella, you start seeing cases of failure, you start seeing cases of death being caused by Salmonella. And so that takes, all of us to take a look in a mirror and say, should these even be the breakpoints for Salmonella? And that's why they broke off. They got their own. And then in 2013, part of the reason why you had a lowering breakpoints, the upper limit of resistant to ciprofloxacin was greater than 4. That dropped all the way down to, I believe, susceptible was now less than or equal to 0.064. Intermediate was now considered 0.12 to 0.5, and then resistant was anything above 1. And so why the lowering? And so it all has to do with clinical cases being reported. So what ended up happening was you get this increasing number of publications that clinicians were saying, hey, I use Cipro in these cases. It showed susceptible. Patients were dying. Patients were not being treated. They weren't clearing, et cetera, et cetera. And so what ended up happening in the microbiology side, everything we want to have an explanation, right? We don't want to just change breakpoints with no rationale. So what was being discovered around that time were something called plasmid-mediated quinolone resistance mechanisms, so PMQR for short. So what we knew for the longest time were some of these Enterobacteriaceae, specific resistance mechanisms that applied across the board. But what was unique about Salmonella was you started to see these PMQRs that were not being not being represented by the older breakpoints. And so you started seeing blips of patients that are getting MICs of 0.38, blips of MICs of 0.6 something or just below 1. And that fell in the susceptible range before, right? Like when you look at the old breakpoints, anything under 4 was considered susceptible. So clinicians would use it. Clinicians would write for ciprofloxacin. But then you get percentages of patients failing and you start to question why. And so because of the discovery of these PMQRs, you had CLSI going back to the drawing board and say, oh my goodness, like we didn't know this was a phenomenon at the time, but now that we do, we definitely need to establish and then publish and then roll out these new breakpoints for Salmonella. Again, think back to who's using this. So we want to make it translatable, quick, and easy for the clinician. And so that's what ended up happening in 2013.
That is awesome. I hope that answered a question for a lot of people that has been on my mind for many years. I don't know. I felt like everyone I ever encountered, some clinicians included, couldn't give me a real great breakdown of why that was. So I really appreciate that. One thing I would probably add just to the Salmonella conversation is for laboratorians. This is one of those scenarios where you think about bandwidth in terms of getting your breakpoints updated, and actually manual testing for these isolates is really a great method. DISC or e-test is a great method for this. So this may be a situation where you would want to stop and look at how many of these extraintestinal salmonella isolates you see a year and decide if it's really, is it worth, validating on an automated system, doing a big validation for that, or are there manual methods you could use if this is seen sort of rarely in your system? So again, just something to think about, balancing resources with need and availability for the clinicians in your center. So thanks so much for that, Minkey. That's really great, helpful.
Yeah, and I want to add a little bit of to that. And first of all, thank you so much for shedding some light into that. I think sometimes maybe those, us working in the lab, we don't maybe think much about that, and we do see, like in my facility, we see there's a message on an automated instrument that says perform manual testing on the population. So it's always good to understand this. And I don't know about you, Andrea, but Salmonella is one of those organisms that we don't like in the lab because it involves all these extra steps, and it involves, right, sometimes you're doing typing, sending out to the state, filling out forms if you're in a smaller facility. But some of you in the audience, you might be thinking, okay, why do we get that message on that automated instrument? And, why are we doing a test and not going by what we're getting on the instrument? So, some great questions have been answered. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I'll go a little bit one step forward, because I know, before, coming on to record this with you guys, we had some discussions about, Cipro and Levo and these fluoroquinolones. They're on a lot of commercial susceptibility panels for certain organisms. And are there any organisms that fluoroquinolones can be potentially used clinically that isn't represented or that isn't identified on your commercial automated identification systems? And one that came to mind as I was thinking about this podcast was the Mycobacterium class. So mycobacteria is very difficult to treat. I had a lot of experience dealing with it my last 2 years in clinical practice, mainly because these patients are not really coming to your emergency departments. They're not showing up in ambulances. These are kind of indolent, slow-growing, nagging infections that really get dealt with on the outpatient side. And that's what I did my last 2 years of practice was, support my ID doctors in the clinic setting. And we would see quite a bit of mycobacterium infections, and based on a lot of patient variables. So let's think about, all sorts of variables patients might walk in the door with. You have drug intolerances, allergies, you have drug interactions. Some of the mycobacterium regimens contain lots of liver enzyme induction or liver enzyme inhibition drugs that might get in the way and cause treatment failure or toxicities. And then mycobacteria are just prone to having resistance. So some of your first line agents may or may not be viable anymore. And so through, the last few decades, I would say as early 90s or mid 90s, the fluoroquinolone class have been kind of side studied as potential options for mycobacterium infection. So, most common cases I've seen in clinic were, Mycobacterium chelonae, abscesses, sometimes AVM complexes, you'll think of fluoroquinolone. So if you guys in the microlab get calls, don't be surprised if it's a mycobacterium isolate that they're asking for add-ons. And I know that not a lot of labs do that in-house. And so, it might be a little frustrating to have to process that and get that sent out to a specialized lab.
No, I think that's an important point, though, because I think it's great for laboratorians to know what's kind of on the horizon in terms of, organisms we may not be actively testing for in our current settings just based on resources or what have you. But I think it's always good for those in the medical laboratory to know if it's a relevant ask or not, because people do ask for some crazy stuff. So.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not to say that, microlabs don't want to serve their patients and their their direct clinicians, but as you guys probably know way better than I do, mycobacteria produces a lot more challenges than your typical bacteria in terms of growth speed, variability in their growth style. So, doing susceptibility testing in those may not be as fun, I would imagine.
It is not. And it's, and anyone that has a BSL-3 or higher lab that does this workup knows how much just resource management that takes to be able to work up these cultures in general, let alone do the susceptibility testing. So definitely not feasible for a lot of labs right now, but that doesn't mean things won't change. And actually, this has got me thinking about maybe sort of a parallel thought, maybe totally unrelated, I'm not sure. But, when you're talking about additional uses for fluoroquinolones and other areas of clinical utility, I think about, you said at the beginning, fluoroquinolones are a bit controversial in their use. There's some maybe negative downstream consequences of using these. So just from a stewardship and, not only from an AMR perspective, but in a stewardship frame of mind, why should we think about using these more or less? Why do people love them? And then why should we maybe think about not using them as much? And are there concerns for inducing, resistance like we see with these other bugs?
Yeah, there's so many sub caveats. So we obviously don't have time to go through each of them in deep detail, but I think I'd like to cover them each at surface level. So, going back to the discovery of fluoroquinolones, people fell in love with it. Why? Well, there's the three kind of pillars for why you love an antibiotic. One, it's potent, so it's very, very fast acting. It's very bactericidal. It's also very distributed inside of the human body. So as a molecule, different than other potential classes of antibiotics, it gets everywhere. If you have a bone infection, you have a brain infection, you have a kidney infection, this class of drugs just moves around and gets everywhere. And then the other kind of nuances would be pharmacokinetic properties. And I know we're not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but as a patient, let's think about it for a second. If you're, have an infection, you don't feel so great. Do you want to be taking something 4, 5, 6 times a day? And the answer is absolutely not. And so fluoroquinolones have really good properties in that it can be dosed as little as once a day, at most probably twice a day. And so you put those kind of three trident variables together, and clinicians loved it. You write it for a UTI. Patients say they call back 12 hours later, 12 hours later, and they say, "Hey, doc, I'm feeling great. Thank you for whatever it is that you wrote for me. You're the best doctor in the world," right? And so those things, they have merit. And so at the time of discovery, fluoroquinolones were working really well for everything. And the two most common usages of fluoroquinolones were in the ambulatory care setting for infections that probably did not need fluoroquinolones, but, it was so great. And so those were things like community-acquired pneumonia, and urinary tract infections. But what we're learning now, and so there's some downsides. Let's talk about it in very quick fashion. So you've got side effects. So side effects that we now know can be very, very severe. So things like tendon rupture, QT prolongation, and in cumulative courses of antibiotics, you can have aortic dissection or aneurysm. So these are not kind of benign things to kind of sweep under the rug and say, "Oh, it's okay if it happens, we'll deal with it." No, these are pretty potentially life-threatening side effects. And then secondarily, you have major resistance concerns. So, the general notion is that, okay, you have to be exposed to an antibiotic before you become resistant to it, right? That's kind of what gets taught a lot. But with some of these antibiotics, that's not the case. So the term cross-class resistance is a problem. So a very quick example is fluoroquinolones. They can downregulate certain porin channels. The problem with that is that it also affects the beta-lactam class. So you can have a patient who's never, ever, ever seen a carbapenem, but get tons and tons of ciprofloxacin and levofloxacin. All of a sudden, get an infection and not have carbapenem available to treat it. So these are things to consider. And to answer your question, Andrea, a lot of what programs have done is to save fluoroquinolones for when we absolutely need it. I think that's kind of where we're at in the stewardship world. You might work with some of your stewardship folks, you guys listening, and they might say, hey, can you guys suppress fluoroquinolones for certain infection types? And, you might be wondering why. So why are we suppressing it for this, but not that? And so a lot of times the suppression will occur for infection types that you don't really need fluoroquinolones for, or you have some equally as good drugs like beta lactams or tetracyclines that we can use first, or Bactrim, right? Trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole, which is really good for UTIs. And so let's save the fluoroquinolones for later, for when we really, really need it. And so you might get suppression rules. And so you guys might get called and say, hey, I really need this unsuppressed. And you might be going, oh, why was it suppressed in the first place? Well, really it's to promote some good stewardship practices.
That's perfect. That's really, really informative. Thank you. Luis, what do you think? How we doing? You got any more questions that you're dying to ask here?
No, I think it has been great. I think we covered all the information that we needed to cover, and I hope that medical laboratory scientists out there and other microbiologists too, that they can benefit from this, and understanding what's behind the testing that you do, and so no, it's just definitely been great. I didn't know much. Like I mentioned before in labs, I work in a huge facility, and when you work with mycobacteria, like it's just mycobacteria. It's like a whole separate world out there. It's like very compartmentalized, and knowing the interest with fluoroquinolones and for mycobacteria, it's something that I learned. So it was really good. I just wanted to add, we touched on it once again, and I always want to tell the audience, check the CLSI, get familiar when you have downtime, just you don't need to learn everything that's in it, but at the very least, know where it's at and know what you can find in it. And you can also find it online as, it's going free CLSI. The only thing with that is like, they always, when the new version comes out, they update it one yearly, they put that one at the top. So make sure that your facility, has done the updates that they need to do before you start going completely up the online one. But I don't have anything else. Do any of you have anything else to add?
No, I think fluoroquinolones. I love this class. I love talking about it. I know some of my colleagues absolutely hate it. I know, if you guys are listening and you guys sit in on your stewardship committees, you might get a little of a hatred talk about fluoroquinolones. And I understand where that comes from, but kind of my perspective is, kind of understand why the hatred is there, but also let's not bury fluoroquinolones, because this is a great class of drugs, but the name of the game is to use it in the right patient at the right time. And so there's a time and place for them, but we don't need it for everything. We don't need it for your simple UTIs or your skin and soft tissue infections. And so let's save it. Let's save it for a rainy day. And when we really need it, it'll be there.
I love it. I just want to say thanks so much, Minkey. This was awesome. You're so, fun to talk to and knowledgeable. And I think this is really great and hit on a bunch of really important topics. And I love this overarching theme we have going right now in this conversation of stewardship, right? Where I would just like to remind everyone that we have so many cool tools in our tool belt. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use them. That doesn't mean we should use them all the time. There's a time and a place for everything. I think strategic implementation and use of these things is important. And that's why this collaboration between the lab and clinicians is so important, because we can really work together to optimize the way we test, report, and use these things in practice, and just try to approach AMR with this more comprehensive perspective and patient-mindedness to it, which I think is what this podcast contributes to, Luis. So great job. And as always, a delight to be here.
Likewise. Thank you for the invitation.
Same here. Definitely a pleasure. It's always great working with you, Andrea, and definitely, a pleasure having you on, Minkey. You're always welcome to come back again. And, if the audience, if you ever, via social media or via email, if you want to request something, a little more in depth, we can always, work on something like that. For in the meantime, we're going over the antibiotics and breaking them down. And then at some point in time, we'll dive a little bit deeper. But as always, Let's Talk Micro is open to requests and any feedback. So just make sure you submit those via social media or email. So definitely a great way to wrap up the year with the third episode of the AMR sub-series. So once again, thank you both for doing this and being in Let's Talk Micro.
Happy New Year.
And that, my dear audience, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed the next episode of the AMR sub-series. This one about fluoroquinolones. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. Thank you, Dr. Princey, for co-hosting with me on the series. And thank you, Minkey Wungwattana, for being a great guest and sharing so much information. If you haven't checked out the previous episodes of the AMR sub-series, please go ahead and do so. Episode 98, which is an overview, and episode 101, where we talk about beta-lactams. So, thank you. It has been a great year. Thank you for the support. Enjoy your time off. If you're taking time off, if you're spending time with family, if you're recharging your batteries, have a great time. So now, throughout the holiday season, I'll be releasing some episodes that they were like older content with some minor touches that they deserve, a fair chance to go ahead and get more reception because they were released early in the podcast when maybe didn't have as many followers. So some great episodes about Streptococcus pneumoniae and also about Enterococcus. So stay tuned. But thank you for a wonderful 2023 with a lot of, I met a lot of great people, went to some great conferences. So very grateful for the support. So as always, continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. You do such great work. So as always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, Minkey,
Continue talking micro.
continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.